So, good evening, everyone, and hello again to all the people who joined our afternoon workshop. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Moving Things lecture on behalf of the Moving Things exhibition team. And our guest today is Paolo Boccagni. He's a professor at the Department of Sociology and Social Research at the University of Trento. And his talk is entitled, "What Do Objects Do in an Asylum Center? Unpacking Forced Immobility, Disconnectedness, Inertia, Potential Futures Through the Semi-Domesticity of Refuge." My name is Friedemann Neumann. I'm a PhD candidate at the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Göttingen, and I'm moderating this event. This lecture's title also perfectly fits the agenda of the Moving Things exhibition, of which this event is an accompanying part. And the exhibit seeks to understand human objects, relations of people on the move or stuck. And it is based on the research project on the materiality of forced migration, a joint endeavor between the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology again, Museum Friedland, located not far from Göttingen in the vicinity, next to Friedland Transit Camp, and the Berlin-based exhibition agency Die Exponauten. If you had not seen the show so far, I warmly invite you to do so, and maybe to sit at a canteen table and listen to or explore the various material aspects of that matter when people migrate or move in different ways. So at this point, I would like to thank my colleagues from Friedland Museum and from Wissen who made this event possible. And I would like to, thanks all people for coming, and of course special guests, special thanks to you, Paolo, for speaking to us tonight. And we'll just take the chance to say a few words about your work. Paolo Boccagni is a very engaged and active migration sociologist. He wrote his dissertation on the transnational lives of Ecuadorian migrants. And already in this study, which was published in Italian language, a topic played a role that really became a key reference point of his work. And this topic is called Home, or more precisely, the home migration nexus. Also subtitle of his home research project funded by the European Research Council between 2016 and 2022. Home often plays a key role in migrants' lives, reflecting longing, but also efforts to create place and in a new environment. And our guest has written an incredible number of journal articles, book chapters, working papers, edited special issues and volumes on transnational migration, diversity, social work, and of course home. At this point, I only mention his monograph, Migration and the Search for Home, published in 2017. And this book provides a systematic research agenda for the study of home and migration. And here, home becomes really a valid subject to be researched in its own right. And this book inspired many migration researchers from different disciplines and fields of research, including me. And coinciding with the release of this book, the University of Trento really became a kind of key hub of exchange on the topic of home and migration, and a place of dialogue and collaboration with leading international sociologists and anthropologists. Understanding home also necessarily comprises understanding the unhomely. One could say the absence of home. And one of these unhomely places are asylum reception centers. Over the last few years, Paolo Boccagni has conducted ethnographic research in such a center. And the talk on the role of things we hear today is based on this endeavor. And we have now approximately 40 minutes a talk. And whenever you wish, we can have answer your questions or have a joint discussion if you like. I will now hand over to you, Paolo. Yeah. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much to Friedemann and colleague for the invitation, for the wonderful opportunity to be here and follow up on the experiential conversation that this exhibition has given us, with kind of a revisit of the same topic: what objects do in the life course of forced migrants, of people who seek for international protection, often risking their own lives along the course. I'm doing this not at a theoretical level, but again, at a very experiential one, as long as I had the opportunity over the last few years to do an ethnography myself within one particular asylum center in northern Italy, in many ways similar to so many more, as places where people apparently do nothing much more than wait while their applications for asylum are assessed. The thing is, what things, what objects do in these temporary and yet protracted life conditions with people? I'd like to address this question through an exploration from the inside out of this kind of bubble of parallel normality, where people are accepted, are entitled to stay in. Often they are entitled in conditions of separation from the mainstream society. So what is the role of material things, of whatever material things in this kind of suspended or apparently suspension of time and space? I'm exploring this from a background of research on home, which actually has to do not only, or not even primarily, with the idea of home as a rosy, romantic, beautiful places, but rather with all the way in which people are not in such a beautiful, romantic and cozy places, and yet have a need for a place of protection, of intimacy, of comfort of their own, which is also, to some extent, part of the reasons why they have been living. Now, this asylum center has nothing of so beautiful, and yet it does have something important there to appreciate, as I'm trying to do, in this case, through the study of material cultures, in terms of what objects, in a way, are done, so how people relate with them, but also of what objects do, how they contribute to enable people to do some things and possibly not to do many more. So the idea is to provide food for thought, for research, but also just for awareness on how it is that objects are used, displayed, circulated, and all the way signified. It is made sense of whenever an object like this watch or any other one is not only, say, something I need to see what time it is right now, how long I can speak before making it too long, but also, say, an object that connects me with something else. Maybe with the person who presented it to me, maybe with the moment when I bought it. So there may be something more than the instrumental side only to a number of objects. This is the starting insight for us to explore things, the significance of things in all contexts, including an asylum center. In doing so, I'm borrowing on a fieldwork, out of which I have started to publish some papers. More things are under production right now. I happen to write a tentatively more theoretical paper on the role of objects in migrant homemaking with a colleague, Luis Eduardo Perez Murcia, in a journal some time ago. Here I'd like to approach the whole topic from the bottom up, not from what theories, academic, philosophers, or whomever tell us, but from what people themselves tell, and actually more than telling, do, by the way of engaging with objects. So, the proposed pathway of this lecture goes along 5 steps. A very quick introduction to the particular place where I did this fieldwork, then how the study of objects and material cultures follow a number of broader questions, and then how research on this is done in practice, to then find out how it is that some objects are in some ways more special than others, as long as they attract a particular thick set of meanings and expectations and functions. However, at the same time, and in the same place, it may well be that a number of objects are just staying there for whichever reasons, which also deserve some attention. Some of them instead matter not because they're staying, but because they're mobile and portable for people. Drawing a few conclusions from this will be the last step in order, hopefully, to engage with more conversation, debates, and criticism with you about the whole topic. So, my case study is a single-site ethnography of one building, one reception center, not fundamentally different from so many more in Italy or possibly elsewhere. This is a place where people, in particular young, male, West African asylum seekers in their early 20s, are entitled to stay, in theory, for a few months, in practice for years, while their applications or appeals are assessed. It's a place that, like many similar ones, is meant to be as little visible as possible. However, it is a place that, for the simple fact of hosting people and giving back them basic conditions for livelihood, has something of a house and maybe even of a home. What do objects, all sorts of objects, do in this kind of place, is the question I'm going to start with. So, how can we make sense of much broader questions of objects and material characters in a place for asylum seekers? The question we can start from is appreciating that material character, so the role of objects, matter possibly anywhere, including in contexts that are not meant to be much more hospital than a very basic humanitarian level. The question is, which I'm trying to address and to show some light about, is why is it worth taking time in discussing of things that apparently are just meant to be there to give people a bad place, some pocket money, and a little more? What's the merit of this? It is my argument that this does have a merit, both in itself, from my side as a researcher, to produce knowledge, to make a little more sense of reality, and for people themselves to feel somehow relatively better than they would be otherwise, and in instrumental ways too. We can start from objects to better approach a number of things, which is also a way to approach two broader questions that are quite pervasive in refugee studies. The first, it's very likely that residents in a place like this, and I suspect in many similar ones, as you ask them, how are you doing today? What are you doing? Would simply say with all faces expression, I'm doing nothing. So, having said that this is not necessarily what happens in practice, the question is actually what happens in a place where supposedly nothing happens. Is asylum seekers necessarily a time space, so a condition of empty waiting where nothing happens? Things are, of course, not only and not necessarily like that, although people do feel in many critical ways empowered, and still something happens. And objects, I contend, are central to this. So, we have on one hand a place, say, like an asylum seeker center, or more broadly a camp, that is by definition a temporary kind of accommodations, and heteronymous one. People are entitled to stay there as long as they stick more or less to the rules, and basic. not to be meant to provide more than essential protection. And yet, as I tried to show, there are many ways in which the lived experience of this place goes beyond an exclusively instrumental use of objects. As I was reading back the field notes I accumulated in this place over time, I realized that there was huge mentions of objects, of all sorts of objects, not only for the descriptive purposes, but also to show a number of things that people do articulate and achieve through them. It typically happens that even in a place made of bedrooms with very essential furnishing, as people get in, over time, it happens that they tend to accumulate things. There is some cluttering even there, which is not necessarily the most important thing in any way, but still says something which is worth reflecting further. Now, as material cultural scholars well know, there are a number of risks or dilemmas associated with doing research on objects. There is, first of all, the risk of being too intrusive with people, but also kind of touristic, to move around, as it were, a sort of zoo with the curiosity with all sorts of supposedly bizarre things, and actually even too orientalistic, if I may say so. The idea that following an ethnicized view of migrants or refugees themselves, they shouldn't necessarily do something else that whomever else does. And there is also the risk sometimes to and sometimes to underestimate the meanings of these objects. For the simple fact that all materialities, as all things, we know what their supposed formal use is. But we don't necessarily know much of how people really make sense and use it unless we do engage in interaction with people, and thereby we have a deeper understanding of their life conditions, stories, memories, prospects, and so forth. So, against the risk of an orientalistic or extractivist, as it were, approach to objects, the key for all ethnographers, I guess, has to do with approaching objects in the broader moral and relational economy of sustained relations with people, of habituation to stay with them. I'm not going to focus on an object because I passed there. I may approach over time in some way a certain object because I got used to stay with people. I was lucky enough in this case to be a guest in some ways of their own bedrooms, of their own times, which also leads, among many other topics, to discuss about some objects, or anyway to focus on the ways in which they are seen, felt, made sense of, used. To typically find out that at least sometime what would seem to be a matter of irrelevant things around says something more, and that something more matters. As a matter of fact, yes, thanks, objects do not speak alone, but in some ways they do speak through the interaction with people and reveal a number of information about their life routines, their memories of the past, their aspirations for the future, their ways of alignment or of feeling themselves closer or farther away from other groups or excluded from others, but also as important their tastes, their ways, or at least their aspiration of consumption. I'll try to bring some example here to illustrate that while there is an important thing in acknowledging the humanitarian side, as it were, the suffering, the very tangible risk of the people who made it here, there are also as important aspects of everyday life, of taste, of materiality that are mediated also through the objects. The key point, in my view, is to approach objects not for the sake of them, at least for someone who is not a designer, an archaeologist, or whatever, but rather as instrumental to something else, as a way to get closer to the processes of sense-making of people in ways that complement what we can understand only through narrative, through observation, and so forth. Objects add something important to all this. So, how are we going to research them in practice? Now, we can pick up all sorts of objects, from the personal to the collective and the shared ones. We can see not how people, in this case the young male asylum seeker residents of the centers, refer to them, as long as they do, but more importantly, on one hand, how they display or they hide them in their domestic space, in their everyday space, and on the other hand, how they use them, and how their ways of doing so tell us something about people themselves, but also indirectly about the place they are in. From the use of objects not in a built environment, in a very building, such as an asylum center, from the ways in which such a place is furnished and decorated or not, we can also make a closer sense of the organizational cultures of this place, of their own view and energies and attitudes toward welcoming someone who comes from such a complex background, of the degree of care, of control. There is always and necessarily a trade-off, or actually a coexistence of care and control in such a place that is articulated through the use of material cultures. As importantly, I believe, for social scientists, from protracted and deep engagement with objects, we can do some sort of conceptual zooming out from the bottom up, in terms of finding out how certain ways of using objects are also ways that reveal what I would dare call social mechanisms, or anyway patterns, in terms of ways of placemaking, or how people in these conditions, with these biographies, with these prospects, make or not themselves in certain place, and scale, so attach a sense of interest, care, or relevance, or importance to portions more or less extended of the everyday lives around them, which sounds very abstract at this level, but I'm trying now to bring it little by little closer and closer to the materiality of one particular space, like the one we are sitting in right now. So, cluttering, the accumulation of objects, happens in an asylum center and in its bedrooms as much as anywhere else. There is little point for residents, and probably for most people, to talk about them as such. There are so many more important, urgent, cogent questions people have to address that there would be really little point to spend one's time with them. As still, the objects, the places are there, and some of them, as I'm about to show right now, do matter and say more than we could expect in the first place. A very simple, but in a way revealing way to start from this, has to do with the gap that we may encounter here and in so many more places between what the expected function of an object should be and the way in which it may be appropriate by people for the lack of better resources, or possibly for different ways of understanding the use of any way of appropriating the same objects. In a refugee center, which used to be, before being downgraded to refugee center, a student dorm, there are lots of basic structures such as libraries in every room, which, for all reasons, are unlikely to hold any book at this stage, but that are readapted as shelves for shoes. as well as for prayer rugs, as you can see in this example, for instance. In a room where people may like, for all sorts of reasons, to have carpets, but there will hardly ever be the possibility to have decent carpets, the blankets can be converted for these functions. In a place where people would like to play football, but there are no infrastructure for them, 2 stones or bricks or whatever can be converted to make a pitch, and so on and so forth. There are, at a first level, at least a number of micro ways to readapt objects for different purposes than what they were supposed to have in the first place. More broadly, we could map the ways to use objects beyond their narrow function, looking at a variety of categories of objects that are present in an asylum center like the one in which I did the field work. There are, as it were, those institutional, those given objects that enable, that afford people presence there, the key to their rooms, the appliances for cooking, the basic furnishing in the rooms, or for cleaning, and so forth. There are some different kind of objects that are there to remind people of their suspended legal status, of the fact that they are staying here now, but it's not clear how long this will be the case. So the folders with the documents, with their applications, but also the textbooks, the driving books, and so forth. There are objects more private in nature, more intimate in nature, that have to do with their religious backgrounds. It may be rugs, it may be calendars, it may be crosses, small icons. People may come in with, and do come in with, very limited resources, but religion is one of those aspects of life that, as long as it matters in the first place, is very portable wherever one is. And it turns out to be particularly important under these conditions, actually. There are important technological objects, too. There are some kind of objects that have to do with improving, with taking care of the rooms, as well as 2 opposite categories of objects. All that have to do with personal care, products for skin, hair, perfumes, certain kinds of clothes, and so forth, and objects that have just been left there over time. I'll go back to this last category at last. But beyond this very broad map, the thing to me is to find out that as once I was lucky enough to be hosted over time in a repeated way in a number of bedrooms as guests of those who were staying there, basically to chat, to have a tea, to play, to stand at the PlayStation and to lose obviously any single match with them. I mean, a number of very simple activities that were ways of staying inside the supposedly domestic space, to find out that the ways in which objects are shown or not say something important about people. I can read this something important in terms of thresholds. An aspect of people's ways of relating with space, with the house in which they are, and with the objects they have around them, is that there are different levels, different thresholds of taking care of seeing the space, the things around them as more or less important. The closer one zooms down, the closer one gets to oneself. There is a certain level of interest for the common space, say the hall, the portage area, the corridors, the stairs, and so on, which is typically very, very basic. There is some more level of care for the shared kitchen in which people have food, if only for the need to keep them working at some point. There is more of an attention in terms of keeping order, cleaning, and so on for the shared rooms, for the one's bed place, there is the utmost, the deepest level of care for the only scale of space on which an asylum seeker has full control as of now, that is one's own body. At that level, there are deeper ways of care that, again, have also to do with the object. I may have little of an idea if and when I'll get a job. I have even less of an idea when my case will be assessed, what will happen next. What I can do for now is to manage the small portion of reality that is fully under control, that is my own self and my own body. So, part of this has to do with the use of what I would call some special objects. What do I mean by this? I mean that a few categories of objects are particularly important relative to the other. Not because people will ever discuss about this. All the significance of objects has to do with the implicit, with their being silent, with the practice. Not with what I say about them, but with what I do with them. But precisely through the fact that by engaging these objects, there are ways of attachment that are important for these particular objects more than for others. The most obvious example, which very much sounds with this exhibition and with the burgeoning literature over the last few years, has to do with the smartphone. Again, we are back to the main scale of space on which people are in control and on which people have some privacy. The idea of the room, these are bedrooms for two people only, but in any case, the idea of the room as the place for myself only is often not so relevant. I realized the threshold of what is mine, or what nobody should look on, and so forth, has rather to do with the mobile phone. For me, whenever it happened, every now and then, that people would invite me to have a look with them at their mobile phones for whatever thing, for looking at pictures, including family pictures, videos. This was a marker of some kind of deeper trust. This was a marker that, as far as the ethnography was concerned, things with those persons were going well, because there is something more that. Having said this, objects such as smartphones, I realized, are primarily, and possibly again, as much as for anybody else, or at least for a number of youth in their early 20s, also primarily the thing I need to carry along to spend my time wherever I may not always have so much other to do. They have not necessarily to do with strong transnational connections with people located wherever in the world. A typical aspect, I would contend, of transnational youth mobility, such as in this case, is that while the potential to be in touch with whomever is clearly there, the variety of sufferings, of fragments of migration that have led people there often result in young migrants to be reluctant or intermittent in their relationships with the country of origins, if only because as long as they are there, they struggle to meet the key expectations that led them to live in the first place, that has to do with providing to the family, sending back money. It's very hard, although it's not impossible, some did it, to take care of this, to attend to this, as long as the only source is the basic pocket money from the asylum center itself. Another, less obvious to me, at least, I had no idea about this before doing ethnography. Another special objects are the sneakers. Now, realizing this to me helped me in a powerful way to start and de-ethnicize people. My interlocutors were and are not only asylum seekers, migrants, refugees, whatever. They are not only people who objectively risk their lives a number of times to make it here. They're always youth with their own male youth, with their own imaginaries, tastes, and aesthetics of consumption. The very limited resources to address them do not make this taste, this aspired lifestyle less important. And it happens that particular objects, like the sneakers in this case, are taken care in a way that calls some attention from an ethnographer. There is not only the obvious symbolism, like in the exhibit of the sneak of the shoe, as a symbol of all the travel people had to do, but there is always also the symbolism of the sneaker as what I would suggest as a way to approach modernity, to feel included, to feel normal as much as any 20-year boy, as long as sneakers are supposed to be a marker of all of this. There is the right of protection, of course, but there is always also, in some ways, the right, I would argue, to consumption, to be normal, not to feel eternally excluded from the perceived range of what seems to be normal. Sneakers being one of the many symbols of all this. Interestingly enough, in this picture, sneakers were typically out on the window sills on the external side, which would cause some tension, because in this way passerby could potentially see the sneakers outside, which was not good for decency, blah, 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 blah. From people's side, it was actually perceived as the healthier and safer option to keep them in a way. They would never leave them in the corridor because they were not going to last. They would never leave them in the rooms because it was not so hygienic. So what was constructed for good reasons by the managers, by the case workers as a not so decent thing was actually the apparently most decent from the opposite side. So the same objects does raise a number of questions which I find interesting in themselves. Now, the next object, maybe more obvious, maybe not so much, prayer rugs. In this case, in particular for a youth with a Muslim background. In all what were supposed to be the bookshelves, you could see food in the down area, shoes, a number of shoes in the middle area, and the carpet folded with care at the upper level. There was among the limited material possessions these people would have, carpets have a particular importance in themselves, and also because they are actually one of the most portable afforders for homemaking they can rely on. Wherever I am, if I happen to belong, to have been socialized to that religious tradition, I am in a position to carve out some time and space for myself to lay the carpet down and to do something that, for whatever reason, including for the consistency, for my own history, matters for me in that moment. Again, this is not going to sort out my problems, but still this is something important there. Also, by the way, because rugs, while being kept in high care, are not only personal belonging, they are socialized between people wherever they are needed, which is also something interesting, I think. Another kind of special objects, these most predictable perhaps, has to do with the pictures, sometimes on walls, more often in one's smartphones, maybe pictures of oneself, of family members, of partners, of aspired partners. Here again, there is a form of reproduction of one's memories, ties, attachment, whether with people who are here or with people who are elsewhere, or even with people who will never be here, that matter, that support to some extent one's attempt to feel a little less bad in this place, in this part of his life. There is more than a descriptive side in this kind of pictures. Next, and I'm approaching to the end, a couple of more points that I find still interesting. On one hand, we should resist the temptation to overburden whatever objects with meanings. It actually happens that in a number of cases, objects are there because they were left there, because they no longer matter if they ever did, because there are all sorts of remnants, or all the stuff, all the TV screens, all fans, all parts of bicycle who got broken. There are a number of things that people would just leave there. Sometimes they were very tangible traces of the fact that so many already used to live there, so many for sometimes were hosted by that place. At the same time is the trace that at the end of the day, people need to travel light. They cannot afford. Even those who had the resources, who saved something to buy things, they cannot afford to carry along so much. It has also to do with the fact that at the end of the day, what I would call the scale of relevance, what matters to me, has typically to do with my body, the surrounding of myself, and possibly not so much. Sometimes it's just a matter of to say, this is not a place we need to care so much about, whether from the case workers or for the residents themselves. There is, however, yes, another category of objects that are those that I would call mobile, which interestingly say something that was important as a reminder for me. To find out that sometimes I was so obsessed with thinking what object should mean for whom, what makes what, and so forth, to not to see what was actually there in plain sight. Like in this short vignette I'm taking out from one of my key informant, whom I'm calling Holushola. His bed space was a relatively anonymous one. There was nada to particularly look to focus on. It was, compared with many others, a relatively tidy one. It was one with a clear marker of what is mine, what is someone else. But yet, the underlying issue that I found important in so many ways is, how come this person has been living here for 2 years? How come there are no traces, no ways for someone to recognize it is this person who lived here and not that and that and that? When I eventually asked my friend, in this case, how could I tell that this was your room and not the room of this guy, of that guy, and so on? Holushola looked at me in a funny way to make me understand, as he liked to do every now and then, that I understood really little, if not nothing of him, and possibly of the others too. Did you ever look, he asked me, my rucksack? Down there, close to the bed. It is something I received as a gift from my girlfriend. I always carry it along with me. That's what matters for me. The rest, I will find it. So there was an aspect that was there, but it was not enough for me to make sense of this, but it also was a powerful reminder for me to find out, to remember that there are things that people carry along and that they have their own meaning, not for the value they have in themselves, but for what they connect them with. In this case, with a rucksack. So, to conclude with one more broad point only, it's critical for me, even if at an ethical and political level, if I may say so, to acknowledge that objects matter beyond the pragmatics, also under these conditions, also under the conditions of lack of income or very, very limited income, of temporary housing, of being in a social, legal conditions whereby I know I am entitled to stay there. I'm not sure if I still will be in 1 or 2 years from now. Even after surviving, crossing the Mediterranean or anything like the one in the next room, even after crossing the desert, even after staying in Libya in all worse places, and so on and so forth. Even under these conditions, people have their own tastes, pleasures, and ways to make something out of the objects that they have available to them. They do not necessarily philosophize about this, but they make sense of them through their practices in ways that, importantly, should not be atomized. These are persons that, in this case, are also young male with a certain repertoire of tastes, of aspiration, of aesthetics, and so on and so forth. There is not only migration to be taken into account here. And actually, objects are also affordances, are also a way for them to be protected, to distinguish themselves from the others, to cultivate some form of intimacy, of being with oneself. Such objects do not make sense in themselves only. If I were to look at Olusola's rucksacks, at a rug, at a mobile phone in itself, this is not going to tell anything to me. To me or to any researcher in this context. I'm going to appreciate it while staying with people, only in these terms. Interestingly, and this is the last point, just to leave it as a sort of an afterthought, I have never happened, at least in this study with people that have been staying in Italy for a couple of years by then, I've never happened to encounter objects that had been purposefully carried and retained all over the course of migration experiences that possibly have lasted years and years and years. Italy may have been only the last step for people that may have stayed before in Libya and elsewhere in Africa. So I was not able to find this kind of object, but virtual objects, pictures, in a way play a similar function. And actually what does stay the same, or anyway what is fundamentally carried along, are people's own bodies, minds, and souls. So objects are there, but we should see them as a way to approach the integrity of people and not as a thing in themselves. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Paolo, for this inspiring talk. I think we can stay here.
Sure.
And, if there are questions, we can take some questions. Thank you very much for this talk. It was really interesting for me to see how many levels and aspects you could relate to migration, and maybe your last comment is really a kind of a call for getting rid of our very linear and static ways of thinking also on migration trajectories and routes and what happens on these routes in a material way. Are there any questions or comments on the talk?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's just a very simple question, but you mentioned that it was very difficult when researching on objects that you wouldn't over or underestimate them. Right. So my question would be: did you tell the research partners you were working with that you were interested into objects from the beginning, or did you more have like a broader explanation of what you were researching on? And also, how maybe you could tell a little bit more about. I mean, you showed this example of the rucksack. But like, did you usually ask a lot of questions about the objects, or would you just rather observe them and maybe make photos or write about them, and then look if the research partners brought the topic up themselves? So maybe you could tell them.
Sure. I think I would. There are some kind of strong generalization here. I think that's a golden rule for a good endographer, almost in any context, is to ask as few and little questions as possible. The point is, well, there is one aspect to it that is people, everyday people, whomever around us makes sense of us as researchers if we make survey. Maybe they will avoid them in all ways, but still they have a clear idea of what they're like. People make sense easily of a researcher if one does interviews. Again, one may not be keen in being interviewed, but he or she has a clear sense of what an interview is. People would struggle much more to make any sense of what one does as an ethnographer, precisely because the attempt is to be there in as light, mild, and non-intrusive ways as possible, possibly taking up all sorts of labels of jackets that do not necessarily have to do with one's professional identity as such. So what I tried to do was actually, particularly in the first months in the center, to present myself as a researcher, as someone who was interested in learning more about people from staying there. That was the whole thing. I would have never focused on objects in themselves. First, for a pragmatic reason, they were one of the 50 potential topics one could pick up on such a place, not more than many others, but also, again, because in my understanding, studying objects means, first of all, looking at how they work or do not work. Only at a much later point with Olusola and a few more, I did ask about particular objects. For instance, one funny, in a way, episode was to find out one of another key informant and friend, at some point I should say, a very nice young guy from Gambia, from the Gambia, who happened to wear a bracelet, a plastic bracelet, which read something like Salvini for president. I just saw that and I wonder, how come this? And he said, yes, I received this, I like the shape. Maybe he looks very bad, but maybe he's not such a bad guy. So, I mean, there are all sorts of episodes in which we may be curious, but more often than not, I think it's interesting to look, to interact, and at some point to make sense also through the narratives, through the self-understandings of the people, but not to anticipate that step, in my experience.
Thank you very much for this interesting answer. The adaptation of new materials is really a very interesting field to take a look at, and there's a lot of irritation going on, and it can be very protective to look at these forms of irritation as well. More questions, comments, ideas?
Please.
Thank you so much. The talk was really fascinating. I have two questions. The first being, I think in my own field work, I also look at objects and how people relate to these objects as objects of care in exile. And I see that they use these objects also as a way of emplacing their, or making the new place as their own, and that these objects also become a tool of education for their children about their place of origin and customs and so on. But then this comes then after being resettled, and your research setting is in an asylum center where things are more impermanent. And I wonder whether you've also met with some of the men that you researched, some of the interlocutors, after they receive resettlement, if at all, and what do then objects play in their lives after being resettled? And the second question, I think at the end of your talk you also mentioned that it was difficult to find people who carried objects throughout their whole migration trajectory. But I do wonder whether there, I don't know, whether there are some objects of superstitions, like charms, things that people carry with them, like a bracelet or some sort of souvenir that they believe brings them luck or safety or protection in their journey. And if that becomes missing sometime over time, then they would replace it with something else. I wonder whether that also comes to play, if, you know, like how objects also can bring that sense of safety.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks very much. So on the first question, I do understand and appreciate the extra significance along these lines of objects for families, for intergenerational transmissions of values, attitudes, and so forth, which was something out of the scope of this particular study. Some of the people I was staying with did get some permit over time after they left or they were kicked out of the center. I did have some more encounters with them, but not in a sufficiently systematic and deep way to say much more. I mean, the thing is that typically in asylum seeker, in Italy in general, asylum seekers enjoy very little protection once they are no more asylum seekers. That is, if they get some permit, some humanitarian protection or subsidy and so forth. Which means in many ways, they keep struggling with the housing, with basic jobs. So the end of the stay in the center is by no means the end of the challenges they have to cope with. The role of objects at that point is something I am not in a position to interrogate more. I just do not have enough data, I guess, to do so. The other question was as intriguing, but I've forgotten it in the meantime. I'm unable to do two things at the same time, sorry. It was about
charms, like objects.
Right, okay, right. I think this is realistic. The thing is that in my experience, talking about, in particularly, the sea crossing or the desert crossing is something that comes only in very particular moment of confidence, something that people may wish to start on their own, because if ever it happens, it does happen because people, for whatever reason, wish to start and tell you something about this. More often than not, they stop along the way. So I found it I have a sense of how things were, but I would struggle to go more in depth that people themselves would wish to, which typically was not that much. I would expect that some religious symbol or possibly some pictures maybe of one's mother would be there along with them, and that they would be anyway in a position to replace them over time. I mean, there is clearly something intimate, meaningful that people carry with themselves more often than not. As far as I can see, they carry it in their smartphone and not necessarily as an object in itself. Maybe it's easier, more productive to focus not on the object that may get lost at any moment, but at what that object does. What kind of tie with a divinity, with a mother, with a partner may be attached to that particular object, and hopefully may be reattached again to a similar cross or necklace or whatever else.
Please. Yeah. Thank you, Paolo. I was struck by the image of the sneakers outside on the window. As you were said, it raised led to conflicts between the inhabitants and the outside world. And my question would be, well, also the bookshelf that they are using for the sneakers seemed to me like an ignorance from others towards what objects do. Did you get a sense in your research of how other people who are running the center, the villagers, or anyone interacting with the refugees, how they read what objects do and what their sense of the objects is?
Right. I think more often than not this was not the case, and actually it was less and less the case during my fieldwork, because it covered 4 years from 2018 to 2022. At some point, COVID came, which meant people were kept more and more at distance. Case workers would never hardly anymore enter the rooms because it was considered not healthy and so forth. So the thing is, there was, and I would expect there typically must be some attention slash pressure slash moral obligation on cleaning, on people expected to take care of their rooms as a obligation itself, as presented as a way to socialize themselves to what will come after. The message was, and I guess is everywhere for the matter, look guys, at some point you will have to leave this place, you will have to pay your own rent, you cannot afford any longer to leave the lights on all the time, to overheat this place, and so on and so forth, and part of that. But as far as the non-written meanings, for instance, of the shoes are concerned, I think this demand a level of sensitivity and then attention that some case workers may well have. Most of them are either overburdened, they have so much work to take care of, or they are not necessarily so trained in that kind of thing. So I would say that for most of my interlocutors on the case worker side, these shoe things on the shelves was kind of curiosity. Possibly, again, it's one of those many instances in which the main way to resolve the curiosity, as long as one has some, is to take the huge black box of culture. Look, what strange things. Maybe this is the way they do in their culture, in their country, in their blah, blah, blah. And this was not a particular pressuring thing, but still I would say that the more prevalent response would be, well, probably in their own cultures, whatever that means. That is nothing, but as an easy way to make sense of things. In their cultures, this must be how they do things.
Thank you. I have, sorry, again, 2 questions, but I can repeat the last one when we get lost in the meantime. My first question is, I can say that in my research there's a kind of tendency that is also reflected in different psychological studies, that the more people are affected by social isolation, there's a tendency to cling on things. And that in an extreme way, it really can reflect a certain complete lack of being able to engage with others. And as far as people are capable of their own body, and modify and work on their body in a sense that it propels them towards the future. In what way? It is really independent of class or something. The more they are detached from things. That is like a very general observation I did in my research, and I wanted to ask you if you have a similar kind of broader tendency you observed in your study. This is my first question. Okay. Second question is, I know that you also work with social workers, that you do seminars for social workers. What would be your major, the major lesson of this talk you would give them as possible case workers, the major takeaway from your talk, the major lesson you would try to convince them to take care of whenever they, I don't know, become maybe possible case workers?
Right. Okay, on the first question, isolation was, in my experience, was a major thing for a number of people. To me, the more tangible and a weird way to observe this was what happens when some people do not only stay in their bed room on their bed the whole day with their mobile phones on, but they stay there with the shutters down all the day, no matter light or night, down, kind of, which is a bit discomforting for me as an observer. It must be much more for people themselves. Now, to me, the body, the dressing things, I'm not sure if it was connected with objects, because really, for most the objects around were cluttered, were things that accumulated themselves, did not matter much. The thing had to do with the beautification, generally not of the space, but of one's body. Hair, perfumes, shirts, all bracelets and necklaces. One interesting slippery thing for me was to work on, in a way, on the politics of perfumes, of scentings. I think I never happened to encounter so many young male people having perfumes on every time they would go out of this center. I think this had to do with, on one hand, taking care of oneself. On the other hand, of anti-stigmatization, because there is the issue of how, I'm trying to phrase it as delicately as possible, how the bodily difference in scentings, how the different scents, how the different smells that our bodies go out, how they are taken to stigmatize, in particularly black people, as the ones that, before they may have sources of different smells, are the ones who do not wash themselves and blah, 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 blah. So taking hyper care of oneself was also a way to protect oneself from the stigma, which I think was, again, an important thing. And is one of those aspects for which, in my view, ethnography has fundamentally to do with the senses, with perfumes, tastes, touch. I understand and respect the number of all those colleagues who do great ethnography through these things, but to me, you have not the senses there, so there is something important missing, I guess. Very quickly, on the case workers and the social workers, questions, what I would recommend them. The provocation, if I may say so, is perhaps at some point, if they find that they have to work under certain conditions, please try and find a better job as soon as possible, which was actually what many of them did do, whomever who could afford to. As far as I'm concerned, as far as people are staying there, the thing is take your time, take energies as long as you can to keep under control the sense of uneasiness sometimes of anger that some inappropriate behavior of people provokes you. Those who make mess all the time, those who try to manipulate you in all possible ways. These things happen. Try and do your best not to over stigmatize, to over shame. I miss the word someone for this kind of things, because try and set apart the behavior from the person you are working with, and try, although this is very difficult, I would struggle to do it in the first place, try to think that the person you are working with are not only refugees, asylum seekers, forced migrants, or whatever else. They're also young males with their histories, with their religion, with their tastes, with their music, with their ways of dressing, with all things that do not matter at all for the society they are in now, but they are so important for them to retain something of their own self-worth.
Thank you very much. What's the time? So, more questions? No more questions? No? Then, thank you for your talk.
Thanks very much.
Thank you all for